Large-scale industrial logging of old-growth forests in British Columbia is happening right now. It's not something of the past. BC's old-growth trees are some of the biggest and oldest living organisms that have ever existed in Earth's history, with trees second only to the US redwoods in grandeur. To come across some of the most endangered stands of these very scarce forest giants and to cut them down today is like coming across a herd of elephants and slaughtering them all for their ivory. It's an outdated practice, it's not supported by the vast majority of British Columbians, and it's not justifiable considering that there's already a second growth alternative that dominates the landscape of most of southern British Columbia.
Groves like the one we're in today, the Eden Grove near Port Renfrew, have become so extremely rare and are also the areas that are most targeted by the logging industry. Oftentimes we arrive only to find that the area has already been surveyed for logging, or worse, the trees have been cut down and it's simply a sea of giant stumps. These are ecosystems that evolve over thousands of years. These trees can be also just as old. Yet, in a matter of days or weeks, a forest like the one we're standing in today can be cut down, never to be seen again in the same way.
Protecting forests isn't kind of a kumbaya nature freak imperative. The carbon, the water cycle, the effect on climate, the negative effects of degradation of forests in terms of floods and fires literally affect our lives. Forests are beautiful, and for that reason alone, we should maintain them. But they perform a function, they evolved for a purpose, because they actually make life livable on Earth.
We worked like around the clock to save these areas, and I realized right away with the Wilderness Committee that we had to do education. Many people said, oh, they don't have very much biodiversity and anything. And this one zoologist came to us and said, well, I think there's a lot of diversity way up in the forest. So we went in the Carmana Valley and built some platforms way up in the canopy. And he found like literally hundreds of new species of insects. You get out walking there and you start walking quite a distance to it, and it really isn't quite like they say. Every place is really unique. So it is way richer, and we are just squandering and ruining the planet.
As a result of the structural complexity of old-growth forests, you have a whole bunch of old-growth associated species. The marbled murrelet seabird, which nests only in the old-growth canopies, the spotted owl, the mountain caribou, which lives in the inland rainforest of British Columbia.
And so if we want to protect habitat for these species, then we have to protect watersheds, we have to protect larger blocks of old-growth forests, and not just a few hectares here and a few hectares there. I don't think we should consider logging old-growth forests on British Columbia's coast as sustainable resource management, for two reasons. One is that we're never going to see old-growth forests on the coast again if we continue to log them as planned every 60 to 70 years. And the second reason is simply that in a time of rapidly changing climate, it's impossible to say, even if we left them for 2,000 years, what the forests that grew back would look like. They certainly wouldn't resemble the forests that we're logging today. When these forests are logged, the second growth forests that replace them are profoundly different.
It's the high-grade logging of the biggest, best trees in the valley bottoms and lower slopes that has resulted in diminishing returns for the forest industry, which has not only resulted in the increasing collapse of old-growth ecosystems, but of rural forestry-dependent communities. But it doesn't have to be this way.
At the end of the day, we have to start turning to a second growth industry anyways. Eventually, if we keep going the rate we're going to liquidate all the old growth, and we'll have no mills to process the second growth. It's kind of a two-pronged attack. We need to start building sawmills on the coast, and we need legislation that ties those trees out there, those second growth trees, the trees that are being exported, to people who want to build mills and employ people, and quite frankly, that would change the dynamics of the industry, and it would also be beneficial to the pulp industry because we would have access to a lot of reasonably priced residual fiber. So I think at the end of the day, if we move to a solid second growth industry, we can create a forest industry that it won't be what it was in the past, but in some ways it can be better. We can do a lot more with less value added, and at the same time bring in Aboriginal communities, joint ventures. There's a huge industry that can evolve. It's just the will to do it, and it all begins with stopping the export of these logs.
Ancient Forest Alliance, TJ and Ken approached the BC Chamber at a directors meeting and asked if we would support, endorse the protection of Avatar Grove. And I remember that meeting specifically because for me it didn't require any thinking or brain power, because I had already seen the results in terms of the activity in our cottage business. And people were coming. They were leaving notes in the guest book saying, you know, we went to the trees, we saw the trees, and I knew it was something. The trees are worth a lot more in terms of economics standing than they are by cutting them down. From a point of view of a renewable resource, and the renewable resource being the tourists that want to come and see something like this, they'll come over and over and over again, whereas if we cut them down, that's it. No one's going to come to see a clear cut.
We're recommending a series of policy and legislative changes to protect endangered old-growth forests and ensure a sustainable value-added second-growth forest industry. The most important of these changes is for the BC government to enact science-based, comprehensive old-growth forest protection legislation. The BC government also needs to support the sustainable development and economic diversification of First Nations communities, linked to modernizing land use planning and establishing Indigenous protected areas, such as tribal parks, which the government also needs to formally recognize and support.
We look at the ancient cedar forests as a indicator species for the well-being of our society. Tribal parks are a modern-day application of our natural laws, the laws of our ancestors, in terms of what are our responsibilities to the future generations coming behind us.
I think it's really exciting that our chiefs and our community are willing to step up and be global leaders of conservation. In order to achieve long-term conservation success, we need to invest in the well-being of people that are deeply connected to place, people who have cultures that are deeply tied to place. We need new ways of doing things, new ways of natural resource management. By reflecting on our traditions and our cultures and elevating our principles and values at the decision-making table.
While longer-term solutions are being negotiated, the BC government must halt on logging of old-growth hotspots. These are intact areas of high conservation and recreational value in order to make sure that the very best of what remains gets protected.
The government of British Columbia has indicated that they would be interested in discussing the concept of revising the Vancouver Island Land Use Plan. But each year we log 9,000 or 10,000 hectares of old-growth forests on Vancouver Island. If we carry on at this rate and we don't start looking seriously at the current land use plan for another 5 years or more, there's not going to be an awful lot to make decisions about. We have to avoid a situation where we talk and log.
The BC government also needs to create a dedicated annual land acquisition fund to purchase and protect endangered ecosystems on private lands, including old-growth forests. Finally, the BC government needs to implement regulations and incentives to curb raw log exports and encourage a sustainable, value-added second-growth forest industry. For the first time in BC's history, we have a green, progressive governing alliance between the BC Green Party and the NDP. If you look around the world at Europe, Australia, New Zealand, significant strides have been made in terms of environmental protection policy and sustainable development in recent decades under similar governing alliances. Right now, the NDP government has a choice. It can finally draw a line in the sand and say enough is enough. and protect our remaining old-growth forests for future generations. Or it can be the government that squanders this opportunity, upholding outdated and destructive forest policies and overseeing the logging of our last remaining ancient forests.